Well, thanks very much for that introduction. I feel really wired up because we've got two different wire sets on. I hope it works. This was me when I got elected in 2017. Obviously, as a result of Brexit, I've aged in the last 2 years. But I'm really delighted to be here with all of you, not least because it gets me away from the House of Commons and the madness that's going on. But I won't say any more about that. So as has already been said, I'm Lilian Greenwood. I'm the chair of the Transport Committee. I'm the Labour MP for Nottingham South, which is a third of the city of Nottingham, and I was elected first in 2010. I had a really long speech to give you about my approach to transport and what I think the future of transport is. But I've decided to ditch all that because we had a quick chat, and just to say an explanation of what the Transport Select Committee is, what we do, how we decide what we're going to do, and a bit about what our current work is at the moment. And if I don't go on too long, it'll leave a bit of time for you to ask your questions. So that's how we're going to deal with it. So just a wee bit of background is I came into Parliament in 2010. I didn't have a background in transport at all. It became the thing that I've focused on as a result of things that were happening in my constituency. Essentially, the incoming coalition government cancelled a big road widening scheme, the A453 in Nottingham, and they put on hold the extensions to Nottingham tram network. So immediately those became things that I was campaigning on because they were very important to my constituency. I'm really glad that both of those things have now happened. We've got our extensions and the road has been widened, but it kind of brought me into the area of transport. So obviously at the start I probably knew relatively little about transport, but having spent sort of 5 years on Labour's front bench in the shadow transport team and the last 2 years as chair of the Select Committee, hopefully I know a little bit about a lot of different things, but probably not as much as any of you about a whole load of things. So just to explain, how do you get to be chair of the Transport Committee? After an election, the different select committees that exist in the House of Commons, and there are lots of them, examining the work of different committees, the chairpersonship gets allocated to a political party. So the chair of the Transport Committee after 2017 was going to be a Labour MP, but then we're voted on by all members of the House. So all MPs get a vote about who gets to become the chairs of the select committees. So we're not in hock to the whips, so we don't have to be nice to the opposition or to the government. We're elected by all members of the House to do a parliamentary role, and that gives select committee chairs a degree of independence. That's a relatively recent change, and that's probably why you're seeing more of select committee chairs out and about. And my reason for becoming chair of the select committee, or my priority, is to change a bit the concept of transport. Quite often when I see booklets on transport, or even when I've had policy documents and they say, what should we put on the photo on the front? And generally it's something shiny and metal with wheels. Well, my view is that transport isn't about shiny metal things with wheels. It is about people. It's about what it enables. It's about how people can connect with their family and friends, with work opportunities, with education, with services that they need, with leisure opportunities that they want. And it's how that transport is the enabler that enables those things to happen. And it's also about making sure that it's for all people. So whether you have a high income or a very low income, whether you are very young or very old, whether you have a disability or whether you are able-bodied, transport has to work for everyone. And that's part of the thing that drives my thinking around transport. So in addition to myself as the chair, there are 10 members of the Transport Select Committee. The membership has changed a little bit as people get promoted onto front benches or do other things. But there are 10 members, and because the House of Commons is very finely balanced, so the Select Committees are very balanced. So the 10 members are made up of 4 Labour MPs, 4 Conservative MPs, 1 SNP MP and 1 DUP MP. But in a way, our party affiliations don't matter. As far as possible, we try to leave those at the door when we come to the committee and be evidence-based in our work, so that we focus on the information in front of us rather than what our particular parties think. And I think that cross-party way of working is hugely important, and it gives extra authority to the work that the Transport Committee does. Now the question was asked to me a little while ago, so okay, so that's who you are and what you do. And our role is to scrutinise the Department for Transport and its agencies. So we can look at the government's policies, we can look at their spending decisions, and we can look at the administration. So when they've set out what they're doing, how effectively do they do it? And generally, we proceed by way of what we call inquiries. And the way it generally goes for an inquiry is we'll put out a call for written evidence. Anyone can submit written evidence. Sometimes that'll be stakeholders, sometimes it'll be user groups, sometimes it'll be members of the public or campaign organisations. Then we'll kind of read all the written evidence and we'll decide who do we want to bring in to do oral evidence sessions. And those are the ones you've probably seen on the telly. You'll only have seen the ones that are really exciting, like when Rupert Murdoch gets a custard pie in his face. That doesn't happen generally. So our witnesses will be a mixture of, we might ask academics, we might ask service users, we might ask stakeholders, and usually our inquiries end with us bringing like the chief executive or the minister in to answer the questions we've devised through the process of the inquiry. At the end of it all, we'll produce a report with conclusions and recommendations, and government have to respond to our reports within 2 months. And sometimes those reports will then go on to be debated in the House of Commons and picked up in other various ways. So what have we been up to? How do we decide what to do? That was the question. So it can come for a variety of things. Sometimes it's the 11 of us who are members of the committee getting together and thinking, what's the big issues? What are the things that our constituents are writing to us about? What are the things that we're seeing discussed in the newspapers? What are the issues that perhaps could do with some proper exploration with evidence rather than the headlines in the newspapers? And if I think back over the time since I've been the chair, so I became chair in July 2017, some of our earliest inquiries. We did one into community transport. For me, it was really important that there are some people who don't have a very loud voice when we're making transport policy. An example would be older people who don't have a car, people who are on low incomes and disabled people. For all of them, community transport is hugely important. When we put out our call for written evidence, a phrase that came back and time again when describing community transport was that it was a lifeline. The government were changing some regulations, so that was one of our early inquiries. We did a big cross-select committee inquiry into air quality. We did that together with the Health Committee, the Environmental Audit Committee and the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, partly so that we could get government ministers giving evidence at the same time so they might actually talk to each other, because departmental silos is one of the issues that we identified as a problem, and an issue like air quality needs government departments to work together. It isn't just a transport issue, it's an education issue, it's an environment issue, it's a health issue. We did a big piece of work around the airport's national policy statement, essentially the question about whether government should give authority to build a third runway at Heathrow. And the predecessor committee did a lot of work on rail, and I thought, well, we'll maybe try and get away from spending so much time concentrated on rail. The national media love our railways. I'm sure it's because all the journalists travel into London on the train. Not so important for many parts of the country. But we haven't quite managed that, and we did 2 inquiries that were very reactive or responsive inquiries. One into the collapse of the East Coast rail franchise. You remember when Virgin Trains had to give that one back. And another one into the rail timetable and chaos of last May. So because we were wanting to respond to what we saw as really big issues that constituents across the country were raising concerns about. But we don't just react to crises, sometimes we're doing lots of other things. Our current inquiries, they get a mention in the things I'm going to talk about, so I better talk about them. We've got one inquiry looking into active travel, which is walking and cycling to you and me. We know that if more of our journeys, especially those very short journeys of less than a mile, were done on foot and on bicycles, there's a huge potential to improve our towns and cities. We could cut congestion, we could improve air quality, we could save people money, we could improve their health. And we're looking at what are the things that government is doing, what are the things that local authorities are doing, because very often they've been given the responsibility to deliver it. Are the policies right? Is the level of spending right? What's actually happening out there? And we've tried very often to try and get out of Westminster as part of our inquiries, and we were most recently in Manchester looking at what Greater Manchester are doing and hearing there from the Mayor Andy Burnham and from the Cycling and Walking Commissioner Chris Boardman. We've got an inquiry that I know is going to be a great interest to people here today at Traffex, which is about local roads, funding and governance. You wouldn't have to go very far before you met somebody who complained about the state of our local road network. We know there's kind of £9 billion worth of backlog of work to improve our local roads network, and that potholes are a real nuisance, not just to drivers whose cars get damaged by them, but particularly to cyclists or pedestrians for whom they're a real serious safety issue. So we've been looking at that issue. We're at the point now of waiting to interview the Minister who's going to come in front of us. And what some of the issues that we've heard very loud and clear from across the industry, whether it's local authorities or other stakeholders, is that more long-term planning would allow to better plan how we do local roads maintenance. So it's not just about we'd like more funding, it's about we'd like more certainty so we can do longer-term planning of how to spend those funds. We've done some kind of forward-looking things. We looked at mobility as a service. How does new technology allow us to completely rethink our approach to having a car? Do we even need to have a car? Places like Helsinki have set out the ambition of using mobility as a service so that by 2025, I think it is, no one owns their own car, that they can pay a subscription, use a smartphone app and pick and choose different things for different journeys. And we published our mobility as a service report at the end of last year. And we've been looking into the health of the bus market, and it's a bit of a misnomer because what we found is in most places there isn't really a market. There's bus services, if you're lucky. There's not very much competition for the market to run bus services. And whilst the picture generally is of a downward trend in bus usage, there are some interesting things happening, including in my own city of Nottingham, which has very high bus usage. How can we make sure that buses have a role in the future, because they're so important to being inclusive and to enabling people to make the choice to use public transport rather than using their car. And a couple of new inquiries you might be interested in. We very recently launched an inquiry into road safety. We know that the number of people who are killed on our roads for a long time was falling. In the last 5 years, that's very much plateaued at about 1,800 a year. When we know that cars are getting safer and new technology is improving the ability for cars to help us be safer, that's a worrying trend. So we're looking at that whole issue of road safety and how do we improve those statistics. And we've kind of cast out our net for written evidence and saying, what should we look at in more detail? Should we look at road safety outside schools particularly, or should we look at people who drive for a living and their safety aspects? So that inquiry is open at the moment for written evidence, and we'll be looking to see what ideas come forward for us to make the focus of our inquiry. And hot off the press this morning, we launched a short inquiry into pavement parking. You'll know that the rules are different in London than they are in the rest of the country. That's a bit of a trend. And pavement parking is hugely problematic for lots of people with visual impairment, people trying to get around with a pram, anyone just trying to get about really. So the government promised to do something about pavement parking back in 2015. So our inquiry, in a way, is to draw attention to that and to sort of say, come on government, get on with it, and this is what you should do. So that's a bit of a canter through of everything you need to know in a nutshell about the Transport Committee and what we're currently up to, and hopefully it might leave time for a couple of questions.
Absolutely.